Okay, so if we're going to begin, I have sort of topics and conversations and questions that will sort of facilitate this. But feel free, we can go on tangents wherever the conversation leads us. But I want to start off by sort of comparing the nature of classical music and pop music, because I think the two stand in stark contrast with each other. And I think we can actually learn a lot about from the culture of pop music. So pop music, almost by definition, resonates more with younger audiences, and it's always constantly changing. It's always demanding something new. But then famous pop songs are still prized and listened to. They aren't forgotten. And when we consider funding for pop music artists, it's incredibly democratic, I feel. Artists are paid almost solely by their audience and the people who buy their tickets and stream their music nowadays. Whereas classical music audiences tend to be wealthy, older, majority white, and therefore pretty conservative. And so an average concert hall will find itself going back to Brahms, Bach, and Beethoven, rather than rely on constant change in new music. And orchestras get revenue from tickets, but have to rely on wealthy donors who get their names on the symphony hall. Now, pop music has welcomed diversity and constant change, and classical music has a record of wanting to be regressive. And then on top of that, you see shocking statistics where less than 2% of American musicians and orchestras are African American. Women make up 59% of violinists, but only 18% concertmasters in a leadership position. And there was an article on the San Francisco Symphony during the 2017-2018 season. They commissioned 50 new works from composers, which was amazing, but 49 of them were white men. And so it seems that the cultural landscape of the audience and benefactors projects onto the stage and changes the landscape for artists in that musical field. And so I can't help but be cynical and say that even if classical musicians want change, and collectively I believe we do, it is impossible unless the audience wants change too. And that statistically doesn't seem to be the case in classical music. So all this said, how can we appeal to younger, diverse audiences and democratize funding the way pop music does so that we begin to see some progressive change in classical music? And let that sit with you as long as you'd like.
Well, I would offer this just maybe to help get the conversation going. I'm not sure pop music is that democratic. I mean, there's a mediation that takes place between the consumer and the producer, and advertising to make something popular. So I see your point that it is democratic in that there is a consumer that will purchase the product, but that product is so manufactured and presented in a way that there aren't too many alternatives for young people. Now, maybe rather than attacking pop music, maybe we ought to figure out a way to enhance change, to attack that mediation process. And can something like that work for symphonic music? I don't know. I'm just sort of posing that. Did we all go mute?
Yeah, I think so. So I don't know. So I think you went over. I think you went over a lot of points, and I think that's probably what maybe some of the challenges are for the discussion. But so I guess like the first question is you know, in terms of like how to reach younger, more diverse audiences, is, you know, where are the opportunities for exposure, and also you know, a majority of people who enjoy classical music are people who play it, and so opportunity to, say, learn a musical instrument, because you know, there are of course several issues in terms of so right, because I'm from a really poor background, and like my public school district was like really terrible, and so when you think about like access to extracurricular activities, which is what music is considered in America, right? You know, a lot of that is dependent on where the money for the funding comes from, for these schools. And so a lot of schools in racially diverse areas like don't have access to these opportunities to learn this type of music, right? And so that exposure is lacking, and that's one of the things, and opportunity to even get the chance to play or know classical music. So that's just my opinions and observations, not anything more.
Right, and that's an interesting point of people who want to see classical music often play it, and the people who play it come from privileged enough backgrounds to afford violin lessons or instrument lessons as a kid. And so are we considering governmental funding of schools so that anyone who can play an instrument should be able to? Is that something that's feasible? Or forget feasible, is that something that would be effective?
Well, in one way, when you say government funding of schools, you're talking about public schools. Mm-hmm. Those are government funded schools, and I think one of the generational differences that I have with some people it's so wonderful to see all your beautiful faces, but I as I look at the faces, I realize that I'm not of your generation, obviously, and so I grew up in a little farm town in Iowa, but I had public school music education from the time I was 6. And so that wasn't because we had a ton of money, but it was just because that's the way it was in public school. And so I'm extraordinarily privileged from that standpoint. But I wonder if we could just unpack a little bit of your opening statement, Gabby, which I thought was so well said, which is to say that this is a problem that reaches into so many different areas of life, because it's, in your initial email, we were talking about the diversity of repertory, and you mentioned that shocking statistic with the San Francisco Symphony, which actually should horrify anybody associated with the presentation of orchestral music, and it should shame them. But it's so much bigger of an issue. The diversity of art making is so much bigger of an issue than simple commissioning or repertory decisions, because you correctly noted that even if, for example, 75% of those San Francisco Symphony commissions had been from underserved communities, people of color, women, people who are normally not allowed easy access to the classical music world, the symphony itself, the demographic of the symphony, the orchestral musicians themselves, the demographic of the audience, how people are reached, who feels welcome at concerts like that. I mean, it's on such a varied level, such an intricate level, that it's kind of hard to know. As someone who is involved intimately with programming in a symphony orchestra, it's hard to know how to attack that problem, because I think that repertory is really important. The curation of a racially, ethnically diverse group of musicians, critically important. But because those problems are so thorny, a lot of musical institutions try to solve them just by ticking a certain number of boxes in terms of concerts and presentations and things like that, which that may be a step in the right direction, but very often then people feel like, well, I guess I'm done here. And so how do we extend this conversation beyond who gets commissioned and who gets performed, even though that still remains a really, really serious question? So I don't know if that unpacks at all what you were saying, but it's this complex of issues, is it not?
Yeah, it definitely is complex. And another question I have sort of attempts to tackle that, but where do we see this sort of bottleneck of diversity taking place? I mean, does it, as Isaac said, maybe it starts at the grade school level, where people are learning instruments, and maybe having violin lessons, as I said, is a privilege that, typically middle-class white and Asian families tend to enjoy? Or is it a problem at the professional level? And is there sort of racial bias in some orchestras when it comes to hiring musicians and sort of diversifying our classical landscape? So on the spectrum of grade school to professional, or is it a little in all of across the spectrum? I mean, it definitely is a complex issue, but can anyone speak to their experience?
I feel like to me, it's more of like a preschool or like elementary school, K-12, like kind of an issue, because like for my school district, we're all lucky that we're able to pick up or like I wasn't there, but like everyone there was able to pick up an instrument at 5th grade. And so like some people, like a lot of people stayed with it after that as well, like to middle school and high school, but like some people like didn't, and that's fine. But I think that early exposure allowed people to like see that opportunity and decide if they like it or not. But I just feel like I feel like my high school orchestras or like band and like stuff like that were pretty diverse, or like more diverse than some of the other orchestras I've seen before. And also I just feel like a lot of people I've talked to, they picked up an instrument that they're playing now because they were required to in like elementary school, and they just decided that they wanted to like keep playing it. So I feel like a lot of times if we weren't given that opportunity, we probably would never discover that we would like that. And I feel like it's more of like an exposure thing. And I feel like it probably continues in later to like the professional runs too, because I feel like we tend to subconsciously think of what kind of people are better at certain instruments based on what like the people that we see when we play in general. So like if we see more like Asian or white people like playing in general, we tend to subconsciously think that like they might be better. So when we like consider hiring people or like putting people into principal positions, I feel like it's easier to think that they might be a better fit, even though like some people actually are like equally good or like better in some cases.
Yeah, definitely. And Ann Arbor, I mean, in Michigan, it was just so astounding coming to California, because in Michigan, I know they require you to, I think, pick up the recorder at like 4th or 5th grade. But in my California school system, I mean, you could go K through 12 without ever picking up an instrument. I think something federally needs to be changed about that.
And I actually, sorry.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I totally agree with your points about like exposure, and a lot of it is early grade school.
Yeah, and so this was like a few years back, and I did a camp in China, and we basically traveled to like this like one rural like city, and we kind of just like toured around and played music to people. And because these were people who were probably like less well off, and they didn't really see like classical music at all, especially it's like China, it's not like a Western country. But because we were touring there and playing, and we also donated instruments to the local schools, a lot of people were able to see like violin or like some of these instruments for the first time. And that's always something I think I thought about after I came back from the camp, because I feel like that would be such a great opportunity like for people to learn about new instruments here. And I feel like even just like one exposure, I feel like we don't have to necessarily require all the schools to offer music programs from like elementary school, middle school or something. But I feel like even just one or two exposure can maybe trigger people's interest, and they will maybe go out of their way to learn more of that later on.
Yeah, so I think that Steve touched upon a point that personally to my experience really spoke out a lot more, and that is really about making people feel like welcome, like in this community, and you know it was really, that was, you know, for the longest time, you know, I myself didn't feel like I belonged in this community, like no matter what I did. because like there was like, you know, I didn't see anybody who looked like me or anything like that. And so, you know, I was very lucky because even though my school was poor, we did have teachers who tried. But then, you know, the first time I went to an orchestra outside my area where everybody was, you know, say like a white or Asian, and then like, you know, even though I had been playing for so long and I really loved just the music, like feeling that like you could be part of that community, like I never felt like that until many years later, and even more so when I went to college. It you know, getting that feeling like you can belong in the classical music sphere, because it's just not it's like when you try to talk about it with, you know, some people in your family, like you're just like not normal, or and like, you know, and like you know, trying to say like when people don't really understand what you like, you know, what you like about it. And then also when you go to, even if you are a musician and you go to these things, you don't see anybody. So I think that's, you know, that in my personal experience was more of an issue.
Could I follow up on that with you, Isaac? Because
Yeah.
I'm also I'm shocked when for example, I teach classes for lower division undergraduates. Recently, I've been teaching this class called Beethoven and the Beatles, with the idea that people would feel that they could come through the door of popular music, and that we would then create these bridges to music that they may not know from music that, I mean, I understand that the Beatles broke up 50 years ago, so I'm not suggesting it's recent popular music, but there was an idea of building bridges there. And as a part of that course, I always have people come to concerts, to Matt's concert in this particular case last year, the Florence Price Symphony, and to the La Jolla Symphony, so that there is some sense that the music that we're talking about in the abstract or on recordings then gets played out in real life. And I'm always saddened by the questions that I get from the students, which is like, do I have to buy a suit to come to the audience? And so what that means to me is that the pervasive feeling of you don't belong unless you can somehow change yourself to be like what you think classical audiences expect, then you shouldn't be there. And I find that just really just disheartening and devastating. And of course, I immediately correct them and say that, you know, I have to wear a suit, but I wouldn't if I didn't have to. But nobody else does. And then I think, well, is there something, and you know, my question to you, and really quite specific, both to you and to anybody else, is there something that we can do about the modes of presentation in especially orchestral concerts? And I know we're talking about classical music in a broader sense, so it's not just orchestra. But is there something we could change about the mode of presentation so that the rituals which feel so comfortable to an audience that comes to the classical music concert will not impede other people from joining that? I mean, in other words, are the rituals that we have, the concertmaster coming on and tuning, the talking from the stage, the shushing between, if you clap between movements, people look at you, all of those rituals that really are designed to make the predominantly white affluent audience feel like it's comfortable, are also simultaneously there to make other people feel uncomfortable. I don't think it's an accident that those things keep going, and it's in a way, perhaps not consciously so, but a way of the kind of established audience saying to the unestablished audience, yeah, maybe you don't belong here. So what could we change, do you think, from anybody actually, about the mode of presentation that would make it more welcoming?
I have an idea as to that. Sorry, I'm kind of outside right now taking a walk, so it's kind of noisy, but one thing that I thought when I was younger was really helpful was, I guess, like literally breaking down those walls. So like when I was at home, every summer that they put on like some kind of concert in a park, like outside, and it's really casual. It's like one of those concerts, like they just play really fun music, and like there are picnic blankets everywhere. And I think that having that enclosed space really just kind of reinforces the idea of white space. But if we could try to break down those walls by maybe putting it in more accessible places and more casual and fun, like kind of areas, maybe that would make it more accessible to what you were saying.
Yeah, just hearing you speak made me think of, so of course there's a group on campus who I think does a really excellent job of this, and that's the Intermission Orchestra, of building those bridges, because they do not adhere to any sort of those like decorum in any sense. So they, I do feel like they try very to a much greater extent to make other people feel welcome, and half of it is by if we're talking about it from the audience perspective, by like actively engaging the audience, addressing them. They do silly things like skits and all this kind of stuff, but within the group itself, there isn't the same sort of rigidity that exists in the normal back and forth between like a conductor and the orchestra, and so trying to so from the musician's perspective, it's about creating that open and welcoming community, but from a outreach perspective, they have visual media, like films and that kind of stuff playing from all over the place, and that for a lot of people who it's like their first time, getting exposure to those instruments, like I think those, I guess I don't know, I think that can just spark the interest, but really about making the environment feel like anybody can just walk in, because nobody has the question of, do I have to wear the suit to go to that concert? That's never a question. So I think that, yeah, that's it for my discussion.
I think one realm that classical music does have kind of that casual environment, correct me if I'm wrong, but with outdoor concerts, I mean, with Hollywood Bowl, people can like talk, wear casual dress. You never really want to wear a suit to the Hollywood Bowl. You're just on benches. Sometimes there are fireworks. Sometimes they play along with movies. And is there a way to kind of translate that casualness into the confines of the symphony hall? Like with
I wonder if it's to some extent, I wonder if it's a question of repertoire. I mean, the concerts that we're using as examples of greater outreach have repertory that is more popular based.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's, I haven't conducted very many popular music concerts around here, but I have, in Breckenridge with the other orchestra that I have. And I think that's sort of fun. I really do like it. It actually doesn't, in my experience there, change the demographic of the audience very much, because the people who are of an age where they really know pop music, they want it straight. They don't want to, a popular music programming for a symphony orchestra is Frank Sinatra hits with a crooner brought in from Las Vegas or something like that. Or if it's something that is more current, then a lot of times it feels like out of tune, if that makes sense, to then have a symphony orchestra dressed up and playing. So I think that pursuing the repertory angle of it, which is one of the ways you started, Gabi, I think is really, really, really interesting. But I think that there's something that is primarily and fundamentally flawed about the orchestra. I mean, the history of the orchestra is that it is exclusive. In other words, I think we have to confront a kind of original sin or original problem with the orchestra, and that is that it was founded by people who had so much money that they could have an orchestra, like the Esterházys. This was the whole reason that the orchestra was there, so that the Esterházys could say, we have an orchestra and you don't. And so it was born really not out of an egalitarian impulse, but really out of an aristocratic impulse. And so we've been fighting to open it up on just purely orchestral basis, but it's still the case that professional orchestras. I don't think that La Jolla Symphony is quite so much in this camp, but it's really going to be good for us to look at this. But if I look at professional orchestras, it's still the case that it is a sign of wealth, that you get a special ticket, that you get to go to a dinner before the concert and talk to the soloist. All of these things are markers of wealth and exclusivity. So I think unless we fundamentally change something about that kind of foundational aspect of the orchestra, at least, that it'll always feel like we're kind of swimming upstream, or we're trying to do something that we're incapable of doing, et cetera. So I wonder if the orchestra is in fact dead. I wonder, I don't mean orchestral music or your ability to play in orchestras, but the orchestra as we have understood it, as this sort of, every city needs a professional orchestra and this is what it stands for, the main maintenance of high cultural values. I wonder if a brand new kind of institution is in order that simply doesn't recognize those and maybe mixes repertory of different kinds of scales, a Beethoven symphony followed by you know, an actual piece of pop music played by musicians who know how to do that, followed by something else. Maybe we just need to mix up the entire format a little bit so that it doesn't feel so comfortable for the world of privilege. I don't really know how to do that, but you're younger and smarter than I am, so maybe you have ideas.
Well, that's not, historically, that's kind of interesting, Steve, because when the public became involved in classical music, there were elephant shows at the intermission. There were comedians. There were jugglers and tumblers taking place. It was a way of introducing what had been an aristocratic instrument to the public and entertaining the public in a way. But I don't think the orchestra, as an entity, was ever an instrument of the people. I mean, I see music of any form always as being political, either overtly so or by what is read into it. And so you're absolutely right that even today, the orchestra, the opera, the chorus is sort of a remnant of the aristocratic 18th, 17th century monarchy. I don't think it ever was accepted even by the public as a standalone entertainment device. And I think what you're trying to do is to create an orchestra that is a standalone entertainment device. And in a way, it's kind of a third movement, not just popular versus classical, but it's sort of more vernacular art. And that's always going to be hard. I don't know if it's necessary to reconceive the orchestra, or maybe we need some elephant acts at the intermission.
No, it's true. Of course, you know, you look at those concerts that Beethoven did in his lifetime that were 4 and 5 hours long, and it was, you know, it was an event. It felt like a fair or a circus of some sort. But then if you go just before that sort of moment where the orchestra at least pretended to be popular, you ask yourself, well, what is the biggest audience that Mozart ever played for in his lifetime? And you're talking about 100 people. So very often there were more people playing than were people listening. So this idea that the orchestra is a sort of tool of large scale reach into audiences is a pretty recent one. And so anyway, I think that and by the way, I have so many thoughts. I'm sorry, I'll try to distill them. I wonder if the paradigm of popular music and classical music doesn't play into a kind of conceit that is too old-fashioned for this moment. Like, do we really need to position these two things as adversarial, or can we simply stop recognizing those boundaries between popular music, notated music, improvisation, readings of texts, all of these things? If we simply just walked through those walls, which are essentially invisible to most people, we could set an example that I think could be interesting.
Just to kind of jump off these ideas, this is a wonderful conversation. Right now, I'm reading a book that asks a lot about these questions about the nature of the concert. It's Musicking by Christopher Smalls, which is a very interesting book. I highly recommend reading it, it really just asks the nature of what is the classical concert and really what is going on here. And so, you know, thinking about the nature of repertoire, I think it's very interesting to think about the uniqueness of classical music, where the audience is so much just viewership that, you know, when you walk into the to a concert hall and a Beethoven symphony begins, it demands that the audience be completely silent, and you give this absolute reverence to this single musical object that's being presented. And, you know, if you make any noise, if you open a wrapper that's going to distract from someone's experience of enjoying this, you know, quote unquote masterpiece. And I feel like that is exclusionary. That really excludes people that may not have that experience with a Beethoven symphony. And it puts it in this very particular mode of listening. And so when I think about just when we talk about repertoire, it's interesting to ask the question of even just the basic listening experience about, does this repertoire even demand a total silence? Why do we demand this reverence of this thing? And how can we start even creating repertoire that goes into just a different experience of just even people's ability to connect with it is in a broader way versus this kind of, yeah, again, I'm just going to use reverence, because that's, especially in concert hall, this wasn't really something that was true in the 18th century. You know, these were party pieces that they were using, but at, you know, post Franz Liszt, it really became this very this repertoire that, you know, you have to be intellectual. It has to be this almost religious experience that you're entering into. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. And even reading this book, I realized, like, subconsciously, I have prejudice against outdoor concerts. I've grown up thinking that, like, you know, if you listen to a piece of music, it has to be in the most perfect conditions ever. And I realized when I would go to outdoor concerts, I'd have in my head, like, this is not the ideal. This is not how it should be. And I, you know, just in the last couple of months, I'd really going like, oh, that's an issue I should confront and think about. And why do I have these feelings? So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there.
I know I've been doing too much talking. I promise I'm going to stop, but I can't help but pile onto what Matt has just said, in that it feels like so much of what we've been saying are really actually that we should recognize them as tools of exclusion. That when you go to a concert and somebody unwraps and everybody turns around and gives you that dirty look, that the message there is, you really don't belong here. And the reason for the concert hall in the first place, and by the way, to throw some more reading at you, the Emily Thompson book, The Soundscapes of Modernity, is fantastic, talking about the development of the modern concert hall, which is primarily an economic idea. In other words, the idea is that you can't sell tickets if somebody outside can hear the music, because why would you pay for it? And if you pay for it, you can't have sounds coming in from outside because it would toxify the musical experience. So the very fact that we are sealed in these kinds of acoustically idealized spaces is another way of separating people who belong from people who don't belong. So maybe we need to be talking about ticket prices. I mean, classical symphony orchestra, I can tell you, well, I wish I should be able to give you the better statistic than this, but it's something like 10 to 15% of our operating budget in the La Jolla Symphony comes from ticket sales. That's pretty standard for classical music. So why don't we find somebody who is, since we in the orchestra world go forward because of private donations, let's find somebody to underwrite the rest of it, make it free, so that the whole artifice of this door is designed to prevent somebody who shouldn't be here from being here, that can just be blown open. It would be an amazing thing. But when I have brought that up, and I have, then people say, but if you give it away, then it's not worth anything, and people don't feel like it's of value, and things like that. I'd like to see that tried, frankly. I'm not sure that the argument really holds.
Right.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, you brought up something similar to that earlier, and I had the thought that the more you democratize, I guess, availability, you sort of push funding in the opposite direction. You sort of push it to like a fewer and fewer wealthy donors and benefactors who are able to pay that 10%. And unless you have someone who's generous enough to
give the money without any intention of sort of overlaying your perspective on the orchestra. Basically, how do you kind of marry this, oh, I want it to be more democratic, but by doing that, I'm being funded by like the aristocracy rather than your democratic base.
Well, that's really, that's critical. And in fact, this happens all the time in fundraising with orchestras where people will say, I'll give you money and here's how I'd like you to use it. And we generally turn our back on those donations because they, you know, that's a kind of cross-contamination that I think is pretty dangerous. I think I may have mentioned this when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, but you know, we obviously had to cancel our concerts this spring with the War Requiem and the May and June concerts. And we had then this emergency board meeting and, you know, how are we going to survive this way? And I found it shocking that frankly, we saved money by canceling 3 concerts. That it was cheaper to cancel the concert than it was to give it under the philanthropic conditions that are normally there. And so that's just a crazy upside down world that I wish we could find a way around. I don't want to take us too far from the actual issue, which is diversity and frankly, I think we should maybe stop dancing around it. I mean, there's racism in all of life. It's everywhere, and so why shouldn't we expect to find it in the orchestral or the classical music world as well? So, yeah.
I think even if we removed all of the money out of the equation here, if we don't think about ticket prices, if everything is free, there's still substantial cultural barriers when it comes to what kind of people want to play and listen to classical music, what kind of people see themselves reflected in, you know, the existing musicians and the composers that we kind of glorify, especially for like what we learn in elementary school, composers who we learn as like the genius composers for classical music, and these people are representative of who classical composers should be and look like. Like children are really sensitive to these things, I think. And I just think the issue is not necessarily just an access one, because nowadays, like, we have so many recordings and you can go on YouTube and you can listen to almost anything for free, and we still have problems.
I agree. I feel like a lot of people think of classical music as like inaccessible because they don't really know like what it is. I feel like something really great would to kind of introduce each piece of music before playing them, and not just talking about their background, but like also talk about how to listen to them, because I feel like when someone is listening to a piece of classical music for the first time, they're not going to understand like all the music theory stuff or like all these like complicated like things that you only know if you were already in music. So I feel like you can talk about like the kind of emotions that you want to look for in that piece of music, or like certain sections where it's like more exciting, and then like just kind of the general like flow of the music so that people can follow along a little better. I just feel like a lot of my friends have never like tried the classical music concert before, because they don't really know how to begin, and like because there's kind of a barrier, and it seems like it's for people who are like richer or like these kind of stereotypes. I feel like people don't even think about reaching out for them. And also like since we're talking about the ticket thing, I feel like I really agree that I feel like if we were to make the concerts completely free, we can get a lot more people to attend these concerts, because a lot of my friends have gone to the chamber orchestra concert because it's always been free, and I feel like it's always a little more difficult getting people to attend the La Jolla Symphony ones. And for me, it's also harder for me to ask my friends to go, because like for them to go to see a concert of mine, like they have to pay a ticket. And like I don't want to make them pay a ticket just to see my concert. And I feel like that kind of stops a lot of people from going. And so I think last year we used to offer free tickets to all the Lahore Symphony concerts, and we actually were able to get like a lot of people to go. I think at some point we had like 30 plus signups, but then this year they weren't able to offer free tickets anymore. They were offering discounted tickets, which were also really great, but you still have to pay like about $10 for each of the concerts. So I feel like that still really keeps a lot of people from just attending, because if it's something that they're not necessarily familiar with, they would rather just not try. So I feel like since Lahore Symphony is like a nonprofit like business, I feel like making it completely free might be like too much of a stretch. But if there are more like community concerts, or just like things like the children's concert, because that was a concert that I thought was super great, because the pieces were short and like kind of exciting sounding, and the audience wasn't like completely quiet. So I feel like whoever that went were able to better grasp the music that we're playing than some of the other ones.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. I think I mean, with a lot of my friends too, especially because they're not familiar at all with classical music, it's definitely hard to convince them to, spend money. Obviously they're willing to spend money to support me, which I'm so thankful for, but, asking them to take this huge risk and sitting in this 2-hour-long concert and them not knowing what to expect, it's definitely something that's, I think, a big issue. And I also think it's interesting if we have conversations like these to bring up the importance of why we play what we play, and not just, playing through a piece of music because it's popular, it's what we know. I think a lot of the audience members nowadays, I see comments on YouTube that are like, oh, I've heard this piece since I was little and I still enjoy it so much. But I think it's much more of an important question to be asking, why are we hearing this again? What is the overlying message behind this? Why did the composer make this piece? And I think outlining these historical moments is definitely going to add to the impact of music, and hopefully be able to draw more people and allow more people to touch into those ideas more, especially in my youth symphonies that I was lucky enough to play in. A lot of my friends are no longer playing music, so I think it's interesting to see if having conversations like these can spark that interest again, or if another topic, something else, in the future may be able to spark more interest back into music.
So Allison, let me ask a follow-up on that with you. I hear often that young people, everyone, stop playing their instruments roughly around 14, 15 years old. There are a lot of things going on at that time in your life. Driving lessons, hormones, lots of things are happening. Soccer games and whatever. But that seems to be the period. It's so at the dawn of awareness of adulthood, people stop playing instruments typically. They may continue later on, but that seems to be the crux, the place where discontinuation of really active music making sort of stops. Do you have any thoughts about how that could be attacked or addressed? For jazz players, gospel singers, I mean, it seems to be those who are very serious about music in any form sort of get distracted off into something else.
I don't know if this is going to be for everyone, but for myself, I definitely found myself struggling with my interest in music throughout that time too, in high school. Funnily enough, I actually solidified my own interest in music in a period slightly later towards the end of high school. But I think a lot of the competitions that I went through kind of beat the music out of me, you could say. I don't mean to lean into the stereotype of this, but because my mom did start me in music and she did push me to continue in music, I think that overwhelming sense of I don't want to disappoint her. I don't want to disappoint my teachers. It kind of led me to stray away a little bit and fall out of my love of it. And I, you know, when I was young, I didn't really know what I was doing either. I just obeyed, did what my teacher asked me to do, did what my mom asked me to do. I practiced when she asked me. And I think definitely going out and listening to music on my own helped me solidify my interest and helped me solidify my love of playing, and, you know, reading into the history of different pieces too. And I think going to the symphony also helped me a lot. I was an usher director in my last year of high school, and I was able to go to all of the symphony concerts for free and, you know, guide all the ushers. So I think that experience definitely helped me a lot.
Yeah, so if you don't mind, I think I would like to answer the original question. So I actually worked with students in that age group before this pandemic. I worked with them every single week. I worked with like middle school students, and it's right before that transition, that time period, right? That you're describing, where people go from, because so when I work with students who are in the middle school, that I feel like in that they do it, and that's when they really have like the love for like the music, for the instruments, for the music making. But what ends up happening is when they enter into that first period of early adulthood, transitioning into high school, a lot of what I see in the schools is that you know, it's all about that community in terms of, you know, they have this love for music, but it stands juxtaposed with not only what they see other people doing, but what they feel like other people expect of them, or like what's normal. And you know, that's more than anything else what I've seen people who quit during that time period is because you know, they feel like you know, not that, not as like this, they might still have that love for music, but like they see their community and they see that it doesn't belong almost, and that's and you know, they want to be like their friends, they want to listen to the same things, and they're like sometimes they sell themselves short, where they will stop because they think without that communication, that's what their friends think is the right thing to do, or like what society or whatever, what's like to try to distill whatever part of themselves to become that normal, perceived normal. That's been my experience, and because I tutored and I worked with these students for years, and then of course it is very sad when they stop.
Yeah, and your point brings up, again, back to the issue of diversity of who are your friends and what are they doing, and where is your community that you align yourself with. And when I think of how I stayed through music, my entire friend group was in the orchestra, and we were like the few Asian students in school, and that was our community. And so it was really easy to stay with it because I was surrounded by people that I talked to outside of orchestra. I mean, these were my friends. And so yeah, again, it's just calling to the sort of vicious cycle of we demand diversity, but that cannot come unless we are somehow already diverse and can call to everyone, if that makes sense.
Makes sense.
So how do we break the cycle?
I wonder if, well, I have a couple of things on my mind that I'll just throw out to see if there's any resonance here. First of all, I had the great good fortune of the fact that my father forbade me from studying music. And so it was the revolutionary thing for me to do, the rebellious thing to do, to continue it. So everybody should have a dad like mine who refused to let me study, because that sealed the deal for me. But I'm wondering, before we, and I see Anthony's on the call now, I would love to talk further with the members of the La Jolla Symphony or people who are interested, because I think if we had a conversation about actual things that we could do that would make our concerts more inclusive, less off-putting to communities who don't see themselves as belonging. That what I would suggest is that maybe we would work together a little bit and then find a time to come together for to a La Jolla Symphony board meeting, where for 15 minutes we could present some ideas about how to make the concerts more inclusive, whether that's ticket sales or programming or the way people are greeted or whatever. And it would take a little bit to set up, but Cecil's on the committee that deals with the liaison between the symphony and the university. And I know Cecil's been thinking about this, and Betty and the other members of the committee a lot. But I'd love to work with you if we can figure out a way to do this so that we together come to the orchestra to say, this would help. These things would help, and we can actually really do them. The second quick point is that Matt and I are talking about a combined chamber orchestra La Jolla Symphony class in practical music making next fall, that we envisioned going around some kinds of repertoire. Matt noticed that we're presenting Mahler 2 next year, and so we were thinking about how do you prepare for a piece like this? How do you understand it in the current, cultural climate, et cetera? But it could branch out to a more systematic exploration of the issues that you all are presenting, so that we use that class to work out some of these things. Because the great gift that La Jolla Symphony has is that it's associated with an institution that thinks about the future. So we should take advantage of the very kind of format that you all have put together in order to make a effective change. So maybe offline, with the people that I know, I see that my friends from the orchestra and Matt can participate. Maybe we could figure out a way to examine these issues in such a way that we actually bring specific solutions to the board, and at the very least, they should hear your voices and not just ours. So, anyway, those are some loose threads for me that we can.
So less a board meeting and more a town hall with the members of the orchestra. I think that'd be an amazing idea.
Yeah.
And then sort of bringing it back to home, as you were saying. So considering changes to the music department. So we talked about, are there ideas for classes that anybody would like to throw out or share, or changes to current classes? I'm not a music major, so I wasn't required to take music history, but did they go into the history of classical music from the African diaspora that we see in the early 1900s with William Dawson, Nathaniel Dett, Florence Price, and so many more? Did they cover that in the music history class?
Depends on which classes you take. I see Anthony's joined us here.
Hi, Anthony.
You're not.
Hi.
Hey, Anthony.
I don't think much effort, but I've been given to Wayne Grant Still and Dawson and Price. I mean, I think Florence Price is getting much more attention in the last few years, which is great. I think we could do a lot more with that. And also for me, I think of the music as a continuum, so I don't make the separation between what is so-called European classical music and improvised, what's usually called jazz, etc. So I think of that as a continuity. So for me, it's doing the music of Mingus, it's doing the music of Strayhorn and Ellington. I mean, all those things are on the same plane. So I think that the pedagogy has to be rethought, particularly in terms of how 20th century music is addressed. Because I think sometimes we think of the kind of hegemonic Germanic kind of tradition and not think enough about the fact that there are so many alternative ideas of music, and I think that and particularly now when I look back and I think in a way everything broke apart with fascism, and how fascism has really influenced, has been such a cataclysmic event, and we're going through another cataclysmic event, and I think we have to think a lot about how that affects how we look at music, because music sometimes represents a national purpose. And sometimes we have to be aware that we don't want necessarily serve that purpose.
And could you elaborate actually on the cataclysmic event of fascism and how that affected classical
Well, I
music?
think that, well, in a sense, looking at the emergence of modernism in the wake of that, as a sort of a universalist, some of the universalist ideas of that. And unfortunately, it led to, in a way, a kind of discourse that didn't allow people to see other cultures, to see and particularly the attitude towards so-called popular culture. And I think so we have to look at that in retrospect to to the events that were happening, and then also how do we deal with what's facing us today, and how do we make the music respond? I mean, I think that's something that, Kurt Weill was thinking about, and Berg was thinking about, and Schoenberg was thinking about to a certain degree too. And I think there's a whole legacy of that music that address that, and I think we are called to do that now.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. So because going to another level is because I feel like we use music to actually almost identify and self-segregate ourselves. But I think there should be, in terms of music education, more emphasis on showing really how it is a continuum between these different cultures, and how in reality everything is tied to one another, and in some ways some of our self-segregating musical tastes and experiences, if we can show how they're really actually all tied to each other, all the different branches, that I think that's a really great approach.
I think segregation affects us in different ways. Also, it's a psychological thing, as Du Bois would say. It's something. It's so basic in terms of how we all view the world. We like how we segregate things in our in terms of our approach to music, or who we are musically. And that happens. That's how it happens almost self-consciously in some ways. So it's something you have to battle. You have to fight. I mean, I remember one day I was on a panel with Morton Feldman. This is years ago, and we were talking about. So I just asked him, okay, what music do you listen to? I was just curious about that. What really excites you to listen to? He said, well, I listen to Thelonious Monk all the time. And I said, wow, okay. Does anyone ever, do you ever say that in public? You really talk about the relationship, because I was kind of interesting to see Feldman and Monk. It was kind of not a connection that people make. And I had similar conversations with Colin and Carol, about his music. And he was always upset that he was linked to Cage and Cowell and all those people. And he didn't feel much of a relationship to them. And he felt much more a connection to James B. Johnson and Louis Armstrong. And so sometimes I think the how we are presented to the world, and composers particularly, you see the effects of segregation, an effect of in a way that's kind of it might have been detrimental to their careers to talk about their connection to those things. I mean, and Dan Carroll left the country, so he could kind of do that. But I think that those things are so embedded that we have to try to overcome and pretend that those boundaries don't exist, as artists, and so that we can look at it as music and not and I think that's a very important step that's necessary for our health as artists too.
The thing that you said, Anthony, that I think is so amazing and relevant at this moment is about the dangers of the universalizing tendency, to say that in essence that all of this, that the music we listen to has universal value no matter what the cultural context, and that if you don't get it, that you're somehow not in touch with some basic rule of the universe. And I've had conversations with people who are extraordinarily accomplished and in their areas and really smart, who will say something like that the reason that the major chord on the piano is so appealing is because it's natural, not knowing that it is the least natural thing you could imagine, that it's an invention of the late 18th century or the mid 18th century in order to sell pianos, frankly, you know. And so this idea that somehow the best music is the thing that encompasses us all, which is on one hand a kind of laudatory idea, except that if you don't get it, if it doesn't make sense to you, if you don't see yourself in the practice of that kind of music, then the only conclusion you can draw is that you're somehow not natural, that it doesn't belong, that you don't belong to that. And so one of the problems with the sort of, you know, the modernists, and I've played a lot of high modernist music in my life, is that it brought into this project of progress, that we were all making the world a better place, and that if we were going to do that, we all had to get with the same program. And it's dangerous, I think.
No, it is. On the other hand, I remember my son took a music together class when he was like 3 years old or something, 2.5. And so the woman who taught the music together class said, well, could you bring, because she knew I was a composer, could you bring some of your dad's music in and we hear it? So I gave her a CD of X. And then she came, the next week she came up to me at class, she said, do you let your son listen to that?
All day long.
She said, because, you know, children they're badly affected if they don't hear something in a major key. You know, it was too disturbing. You know, it's like, it was very, very funny to me. You know, like what you said about the major key and being natural, that brought that back.
Incessant clinging to sort of the traditions of classical music. I mean, like you said, with the psychological research, I think it's, oh, your babies will be smarter if you let them listen to Mozart. Like specifically Mozart, they played the music of Mozart. And like you said, the major key is so standardized, but how can we even begin to sort of rewrite that in people's minds and people's ears?
But they never did the test with Charlie Parker, you know.
Yeah. But is it just a matter of persistence of new repertoire to sort of overwrite the tradition of classical music? Or does it go deeper than that, like restructuring music theory classes even?
Yeah, I think music theory, I mean, that's where it comes in. I mean, I remember taking music theory at Yale, and I had these, I had theory with Alan Ford. And but later he became interested in Broadway tunes, which is really funny. But at that point, it was, you know, he was Mr. Set Theory and stuff. So I was taking it, and I would say you're just taking away all the interesting parts of the music. I mean, I remember analyzing Chopin. I said, you know, the most interesting part of the embellishment stuff, you know, I mean, this whole hierarchy like a Schenker, and that's, you know, some of it didn't make sense to my ears, you know. So, you know, if everything's reduced to a third, who cares? So.
Sort of transitioning, this was from an article I read yesterday. Some of you may know more about this, but Joseph Horowitz kind of talked about the School of American Compositional Music in the early 1900s, and he said that there's a forgotten history in American classical music when Dvorak came to the New World, and he said that, I am now satisfied that the future of music of this country must be founded upon what are called Negro melodies. Yeah, and in them, I discover all that is needed for a great and noble school of music. He gathered together a school of musicians, black and white, to mold American classical music using songs from folk, Native American and Black vernacular. And Gershwin also championed this with Porgy and Bess, which is seen as so quintessentially American. And Black composers like William Grant Still, William Dawson, Nathaniel Dett, and Florence Price gained national acclaim, but then were pushed to the side, and in some cases I think Dawson, the broadcast was stopped because listeners found out that they were African American. And then you see Aaron Copland and Virgil Thomas came along and presented this whitewashed compositional school of American music that became the predominant Yankee Doodle sound of America's symphonies in the early 1900s. And Joseph Horace writes that because Black music was shut out of the classical world, it migrated to pop music, where of course we see a much more diverse landscape. My question, how can we begin to offer reparations for the inattention that Black composers received and the hijacking of classical music away from that truly American sound founded on the Black vernacular as Dvorak prophesied? So what can we do to counteract that?
I'm not sure that I have an answer to that very complicated question, but I can tell you, or your proposition, but I can give you a little anecdote of when we played the Florence Price First Symphony last year in Colorado with my orchestra there. And I said to the audience before that if you find yourself saying this sounds like Dvorak, you should say that Dvorak sounds like Florence Price. That in fact, working much later, Florence Price came after Dvorak, but she really influenced him because this is the framework for that music, which was borrowed in the case of Dvorak and not in the case of Florence Price. But of course, we were dealing with economic questions to some extent also. I mean, and I asked myself, how is it that the music of Aaron Copland, a gay Jewish communist, has now become the quintessential Americana that you sell Chevy pickup trucks with? You know, it is a sort of co-opting of a successful emblem for the purposes at hand. So a sort of rebranding would be a good place to start.
Yeah, one thing to look at too is Bernstein's thesis when he graduated from Harvard was very interesting because he sort of re-amplified some of Dvorak's comments, because he said American music should be based on the development also of African American music, you know, and I think that's important to remember as well. Also, one person you know man is Harry T. Burleigh, who was also a student of Dvorak's, and was one of the ones who was part of the whole spiritual revival and the his arrangements of spirituals, such important influence today.
Yes, but I think definitely more attention has to be made to these composers. I think one of the predominant names that sort of stood out was the Negro Folk Symphony, that allegedly got a standing ovation after the second movement, which is in 1930 and today is completely unorthodox. So it's really phenomenal. And this is more to Anthony Davis, but William Dawson once wrote that, to me, the finest compliment could be paid my symphony when it has its premiere is that it is unmistakably not the work of a white man. Maybe can you speak to the statement and how this correlates with your composing of African American operas with Malcolm X and the Central Park Five?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think of what I wanted to do. Also, I think that you have to realize that this kind of changes aesthetic too. I mean, it's not that the idea of African Americans just you know being brought in to be assimilated and to create music and art that is some kind of semblance to what the European American tradition is. So you have to define it. So for me, you know, doing X and other operas, I was trying to redefine what opera is too. I mean, to say, okay, take the form, and I was fascinated by the form, and then how I can make it mine, how I can make it speak to my concerns and tell the stories that are so important to my community, you know. And that's something that's always been behind what I do. And I also have to think, one thing people forget about Troubled Island, William Grant Still's opera, which was actually debuted at New York. It was the first American opera commissioned by New York City Opera in 1940, I think 49. And it was very interesting because Halash, who did running the New York City Opera at the time, had an open competition. It was blind competition for composers to submit operas, and then they were going to choose the best one to perform. And they chose Troubled Island, not knowing that it was an African-American composer. And there was a huge uproar about it. The whole, New York composer community was outraged that they chose William Grant Still for the piece. And his career is very interesting because he was in Los Angeles too, and then how he was kind of shunned by the composer community. There's a lot to be ashamed about in terms of how African American composers were treated over the years. And then also look at music of Hale Smith. I mean, it's not another name that should be mentioned. Who's a fantastic musician, who was a kind of mentor for me. Because he was also had worked a lot with Eric Dolphy, and so bridging the gap between the improvised music and composed music. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done. Looking at this music and realizing that we're looking at also a different kind of aesthetic, and to embrace the different alternate aesthetic to kind of to what was going on. It's particularly the 60s, 70s, and afterward. Hey, Matt.
Hey, thank you for that. One issue I just wanted to ask the group today, speaking about some of the historical African-American composers, and I run into this issue with wanting to program more historical female composers as well, is for me, I keep running into the issue of availability of scores and parts. This is just and this is something I think a lot about, especially in the last couple of years, is, when I sit down to program a concert, I will find these pieces that exist that maybe don't have a recording. And I know the score exists out there somewhere, but it's very difficult to get. And it always dawns on me that it's just so easy to go back to the standard repertoire because the music is so available. It is just so easy to get, the music of Edvard Grieg, because all of it is on IMSLP right there. All the bowings are, everything is just, it's just so easy. And there's so many other wonderful composers who are minorities that this music is just not available to me. And I have to, now it's made me really search and fight and go out to this music. But I just wanted to open this question about how we can just make this music available. One thing I actually do this when I'm bored and watching TV, is I just try to take these scores that I have but have no orchestra, no one's actually spent the time to make the orchestral parts, and I just sit there with a music notation software and I just enter in the parts, and it's just what I do with my free time. And over a couple of months I have a set of parts, and then I can do it. I mean, but it's an extraordinary amount of work, and it's on some level completely unpractical. But I just wanted to kind of throw this out there about how to get this music out there and become it as available as the parts for Beethoven. So
I just wonder if I could respond to that, Matt. And it feels to me that one of the problems that we experience in contemporary music in general, but it's exacerbated when you're talking about underrepresented populations within the composition community, is the absence of a sort of second generation advocacy. In other words, it's not hard to get a premiere played, especially if there is some occasion, but how do you get a second performance? How do you get a third performance, a fifth performance? Pardon me. And one of the reasons I bring this up, and I don't know what you did about this when you played the Florence Price First Symphony, but the parts that are available, the violin concertos are different, and some of the pieces that were uncovered more recently are different. But the First Symphony especially is so full of errors. And I've done it a couple of times, but the last time the orchestra was all kind of snitty about this. How is it? We don't even know this is the wrong note, etc. And I said, this is what happens when you get played once and then dropped. Is that there's not a generation then of people who will curate that necessary linkage between the excitement of a premiere or the occasion of a premiere and its entry into a broader world and a more generalized conversation. So when you say, I mean, first of all, that's fantastic what you're doing, the creating of scores. You're essentially fulfilling the job of an editor or maybe a musicologist in this regard. And it feels like a ton of work, but it is the work that always has been done in order to get from first performance to established performances. And we've somehow, because there are smaller numbers of economic rewards for second through 10th performances. I mean, if you commission a piece and it's already been played in New York and in London, then people they want a new one. They don't want to hear that part of it. And so I think that it's not actually more work now than it ever was. It's just that work is not being done for a lot of people. So how do we get this stage of advocacy so that once a new piece is a part of the language, that it becomes, so that it really seeps into our consciousness?
Oh, one practical thing. Do you know Trevor Weston, Matt? Do you know him at all?
No, I don't.
He's done a lot of work on the Florence Price archive. And I've been part of the restoration process of some of these pieces is because of Trevor worked on it. He's a composer and a very interesting guy. So it's
very available also. Yeah. And
also his music's interesting too. So, so I would advocate for Trevor as well. But yeah, I mean, it's hard with also with publishers. I mean, I've had a weird relationship with publishers too. I mean, and I think a lot of my African American colleagues have had the same. You know, like I remember doing when I did Amistad, and my assistant and I made a whole list of errata, you know, of all these things that should be corrected in the score and parts. And we did a comprehensive list of things. Yeah, okay, so I sent it to my publisher at the time, G. Shermer, and then I guess a number of years later they were going to do a revival of it, Spoleto Festival, and I was going to do some revisions of it. So I wanted to see what the score was, and so they sent me the score, and they had none of the errors were fixed. Zero. I couldn't believe it. I mean, it's just like, you know, really. So now I have to go through and do the same, you know, go through the same list of things, and you know, it was kind of unbelievable. So not only was I putting in the revisions I was doing, but I had to make sure that the errors that were in the original were corrected too. But that was common. That was my experience, you know.
Well, but yeah, publishers, it's a long story, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I remember when we did the first performance of Lei Liang's opera, the one that Susan, you know, commissioned, etc. And this was at UCSD, and Schott sent, I think, an intern from their New York office to be present. You know, this was, I'm sure, but let's put it this way: a young person who came up to Lei and me after the concert and said, "Yeah, we told Lei he could only write for 8 instruments, and so that's great that he did," or something like that. And I thought, why isn't Lei telling you what he's going to write for? So I just thought, this is a person who's been out in the world for like 18 months telling Lei that, you know, you couldn't possibly get a performance if it was more than 8 instruments. And I think, okay, well, we are upside down here.
So we've been talking about things sort of in the abstract and sort of yelling into the void about things that need to be changed. And obviously you guys are very renowned professional musicians, but the students here, I mean, what small rebellions can we make to change the culture? You know, Matt did a very noble thing of putting these things to score, but that shouldn't be his job, right? I mean, what institutions need to take action and how can amateur musicians and audience members of symphonies affect them?
Gabby, I've been sitting on this thought for a while back about our initial discussion about access and sort of maybe what the university can do right away in terms of classes. And when I was thinking about the sort of systemic and structural barriers that keep people from getting into classical music and from picking up an instrument for their style, I thought about how on the university's triathlon team, I'm an officer, and we know that we have a lot of people who come to us who want to find just a group to, work out with, but they have never, they have no experience swimming. They've never really ridden a bike. So what can we do to take them from, I guess, zero experience to people who can actually participate in our community? And I was wondering, what does the music department have for people who don't have any experience playing, say, a violin, cello, viola, or bass, or any other instrument, and sort of fold them into the community? Because I know the university can take, for example, people with zero computer science experience and turn them into, software engineers. But for some reason, it hasn't been, to my understanding, the role of a university to take people with no musical experience and turn them into classical musicians. It seems like the only people who are participating in the classical musical community at UCSD are the people who have been so lucky to have started an instrument early on. And while it's important to call for changes in those earlier institutions to get more access at a younger age to music, what can the university do right now to sort of affirmatively try to fold more people in?
So I was actually thinking about the same thing a while back, and it was one of the things I wanted to do when I started SSA is to kind of pair people who already play music with people who want to get into music. And so I remember when I joined UCSD and I was trying to continue private lessons, and I was told that there is a very limited availability even for people who have already played before. So I feel like in that case, if you were someone who wanted to start from the beginning on violin, cello or something, I feel like it'd be even harder to get started on that. And I feel like if the music department is willing, maybe we could try to fundraise to purchase some instruments, to have a program where we compare people who are more experienced musicians with people who want to get started, and or just to, if the music department could have more graduate students or people like that who could possibly offer private lessons. So I think, I'm not sure if this is true, but I think that in the music building, if you were to offer paid private lessons, it's not allowed. So I feel I'm sure there are more reasons behind that, but I feel like there's definitely also people who will be willing to pay for lessons just to get started, because I was definitely willing to do that, but I feel like it wasn't really doable. So I feel like anything of that sort where people can get their foot into music at UCSD campus, I feel like that'd be really useful.
Yeah, I feel like both both of your guys' points were really, really valuable. Because previously, I talked a little bit about how we were talking about how students, when they reach that age of 14, we're just entering high school. That's when you see most people quit, and we talked about the lack of diversity as an issue. And one of the main reasons is of course if they don't see anybody else of their race represented, or they don't have any friends who are in that community, so they don't feel like they belong. However, Imran brought up a really good point, and that is So of course, these young adults, you know, that around the age of 14, they start to try to form that identity, right? And just try to establish, and they're seeking out who they want to become. And then they'll create that identity. But for the people who are lucky enough to go to a university, there's almost like a second opportunity, a second chance for people to redefine themselves and to actually open up. And really, it is a missed opportunity to have the opportunities for everybody to start, because we identified, you know, exposure is one of the main challenges, but you know, there's so much cross cultural communication that happens in the university environment, and without that platform in place for people with no experience, I do feel like that is a barrier.
And I just have a side thing to add as well, from kind of related to what we're talking right now, from a while back. And so Steve said that you and Matt were thinking about sharing a chamber orchestra at La Jolla Symphony class. And I feel like that'd be a really great opportunity, because I feel like there are definitely like stereotypes of people that have for people in different ensembles. And I feel like it'd be really great to kind of combine everyone who just likes to play music. And another thing was that I feel like maybe something that we can all help, like the department and also like the music organizations. I feel like one reason that I continued music in college was that the community I have for music in high school was so great that I just really wanted to continue that. And I, even like after starting SSA, I feel like the community still isn't there yet. And I feel like if the music department could help us a little more connecting the music students and people who are just enjoying music, I feel like we can create this community where people are more inclined to join music, or just to get exposure, or just get their friends into music. And I feel like that'd be really great as well.
Really happy to have a conversation with you, Victoria, about the specific ways that we could do that. I think that's really important. I would say one of the things that I like about the La Jolla Symphony, and Matt and I haven't even talked about this, and I've still got emails into the department, so I'm only just speculating right now. So I don't know if the course will emerge the way I imagine it, but I'd also like to have some of the volunteer community members of the orchestra be a part of this course. Because one of the things that I think is that the La Jolla Symphony has to offer is to put students next to professionals from other areas, to see that you don't have to give up music because you go on and you're a physician or a physicist or an oceanographer or whatever that might happen to be. And I think that's a really strong thing. I mean, Imran was talking about the can we somehow extend ourselves to people who on the beginning side of instrumental or vocal study might feel excluded? Can we bring people like that into our world? And I think there is a similar situation on the other side. Let's say you've played an instrument your entire life, and you've played in high school and you've played in college, but you're not going to be a professional musician. How can we then help people understand that the performance of an instrument or singing or simply being a part of the musical community is possible for you, even if you don't join the San Diego Symphony or pursue it as a professional? I think if the message is to music students, practice really, really hard, you might make it, but if you don't, then drop your instrument and start something else. If that's the message in any possible way, I think we've really failed. So I think we want to extend that spectrum on both sides.
And also the message of just starting young. I mean, when you think about the people who can afford private music lessons and buying new instruments from age 5 onwards, I mean, this is really limiting it to the upper economic brackets. And it's it's such a clear bottleneck restricting classical music. But yeah, we actually have a question from our comment section. What if there was a program where if people volunteer to help with things, they could get some music lessons in return? And so sort of not having your economic bracket factor into your ability to play classical music.
I kind of like that idea. I can see it in a number of different sort of ways. I mean, it's sort of like finding a way to bridge higher education with the settlement house. I grew up in New York with taking lessons at the local settlement house. I think I had 25 cents, which is probably $1.50 there, for music lessons. But it was underwritten by Columbia University, a couple other universities sort of provided space, some part-time teachers. You know, and we've been talking about silos all during this session, about the cultural silos, the economic silos. I think our institutions are siloed in that sense, that universities aren't talking to high schools really about what the A through G course, A through H courses should be. And I think music is always the one, or the arts are always the areas that are going to suffer. They're always going to suffer. If there's an economic downturn and parents who are the ones in the superintendent's office, they're going to demand AP physics, not violin lessons. And that's, so who gets lopped off is the kid who can't pay for the lessons. And it's all part of a system of destruction of the lower classes. But I think your idea, Gabby, is about trying to find a way to have a broader cross-sections of institutions supporting the development of music in young people, very young people. And that's, so when I say I like the idea of higher education coordinating with high schools, or what would be the equivalent of settlement houses, provide lessons. I think that's worth pursuing.
And so that's actually there is an organization on campus. It's obviously it's not the university, right? It's the students of the university who volunteer time to do exactly that. I mentioned that I go to middle schools. I know Allison went to elementary schools, and everything's for free. But of course that's really dependent on the people who are behind it. It's not institutionalized in any sense.
In some respect, you don't want to institutionalize it.
True.
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of add to that. So the organization that Isaac is talking about is called IMEM, and they basically go to local schools and they tutor kids. And I feel like, so we shared a collaboration with all the music orgs to put up a concert last year. And when we had our meetings, we kind of have one general trend, which was that music department is kind of distant from all the music orgs, and that it's really hard to get some help from the music department. So say that we want to recruit people who are interested in music, and naturally a lot of these people are going to follow the music department page or Instagram and newsletters, so on. And so one thing that we talked about when we had our meetings there, was that the music department was unwilling to share the resources that we have to offer on the UCSD campus. So when we were recruiting, for example, they're trying to recruit people who can go to local schools to help teach instruments, and because they can't get the best exposure that they can get from UCSD, it's really extra hard for them to reach that step. So and I've actually kind of tried to have this conversation with some people in the music department. Is there a way for the music department to be more involved with the music orgs, or is there a way for us to be more connected to the music department? Because I feel like one of the issues I see right now is that I feel like music is so distant from everything else at UCSD, especially because for undergrad, at least, it's very strongly STEM school. So I feel like people already don't get the exposure for arts that they they should. And because like the resources are all over the place, I feel like it's even harder for people to know where to go to if they have some like any specific purposes with music, and it's just really hard to get what they need, I feel like.
Yeah, it's hard, but we've seen like what we can do when we succeed as well, and it's really amazing. Like our Chamber at the Che concert was so incredible. It was like on a Wednesday night, and I think we had 100 students showed up, and they were just, it was completely casual. Everyone was like sitting on the floor basically in the Che Cafe, and it's really I think what we're talking about, like what we want classical music to look like accessible, not just older white men. I mean, student orgs and sort of have the mission of accessibility and diversifying audience, and how we started this off, like a more diverse audience sort of projects onto the stage because the audience demands what they want to see out of the musicians.
Yeah, I think just one of the points that Victoria trying to make, and you know, looking at volunteering is of course it is I think it's amazing that there's so many students have come forward to volunteer their time, but you know, but there is a music community at UCSD, and I think that we all together you know have a lot to give to the community, and you know, if you know, it wasn't just restricted to, you know, say undergraduate students who are volunteering, but on all levels and all age groups, and because we all have the same goals, and especially for today's dialogue, and you know, and that is one direct way, probably the simplest direct way, right? Of you know, how do you limit the problem of exposure? You know, how do you limit the problems of economic inequality? And you know, by, you know, going directly to places like where I grew up, which are minority majority areas, and providing those opportunities that wouldn't exist otherwise because the economics don't allow it. That is something that a university has the power to do, and that's unique to the power of the university environment.
I agree with that, Isaac. I think it's really important. And I also think there's another step to that, though, and that is that the so-called outreach efforts that a lot of classical music institutions and academic institutions have are thwarted because they're built on this idea that we have something precious and great and that you don't, and we're in our heroic stances bringing this thing to you. And I think that once that dynamic has been put in, that it develops in and of itself a kind of weather system of powered inequalities. That I think if we can find a way where there are these places of reciprocal wisdom, so that the people who don't know always about what we do can be interested in what we do, but then we come to those other communities that may not be steeped in classical music training to learn how music is made there, so that it doesn't feel like it's a one-way street of information flow, but that there's a place of reciprocal wisdom. And so I think that's a hard thing to manufacture, but those kinds of, you know, professional orchestra outreach concerts where, yes, we're going to deign on a Tuesday morning to go out to a classroom and it's just a service that we have to do, and then we'll be back to our usual thing later. That's got a short, I don't know if that really makes long-lasting change, but could we find a way where the wisdom goes both ways?
That's a good point. So kind of like likening classical music outreach, because classical music is, I mean, so traditional. It's almost like Christian missionaries. Like we're just bringing this ancient organization and being like, oh, we're not going to change it, but you can join us if you want.
We'll feed you.
How do we find like an intermediary?
Yeah, I was wondering about how successful has the LA Phil been with Duhamels? In LA, I know they do a lot in the schools, and a lot of musicians, and a variety of musicians with different backgrounds also in schools. So has that been a successful model or not?
I don't have a lot of I don't have a lot of knowledge about that. Also, but of course, the El Sistema is the thing that's built on, and I always thought that it might be more interesting instead of having a system to have a process. So you start in with, okay, well, how do we react? How do we relate to music? I mean, I was on a panel with Vijay once, and he was talking about how someone was talking about hip hop and how it was a kind of in the quotation marks, which I'll say because this is not my sentiment, that it was a sort of proto-music. That's what the critics said. And Vijay said, well, music is the language of people. So if you're saying that hip hop is proto-music, then what you're saying is these are proto-people. And so, like, how do we get the idea that music is not product, but process into the conversation?
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point. I apologize, I've been speaking a lot, but you talk about like how it's unsuccessful, say putting these classical music programs out in these areas that don't want it. But Professor Davis, or Anthony Davis, like earlier said, talking about like how it's a spectrum, right? And so you have to find that avenue to connect, because all music is connected, right? And so say something, right, that UCSD has tons of resources for things like say like recording studios and of course and so many people I remember being in high school, like their dreams are to become, say, like music producers or rappers, that kind of stuff, but right, you can build that bridge in terms of here we'll help you achieve your dreams, but in the process, you can learn a lot about all of the whole spectrum, what the whole spectrum of music has to offer. And nowadays, like with tools, like every iPad has GarageBand, which is also like people use it for music production, but it also has all of the tools you would ever need to train anybody in music theory and appreciation of classical music. And that's that's just one way of just making a connection. That's just what I'm brainstorming.
Can I ask a question about how the young people's concerts have impacted the community? I'm very curious to know if anyone knows anything about how that's had a positive or negative impact on young musicians or young kiddos who are looking to start. Does anyone know about that?
Are you talking about for in La Jolla Symphony or in general?
Or I mean in general too, but I mean I've played in La Jolla Symphony's young people's concerts before, and I mean when I was little, our schools actually had a field trip day for us, and we'd go listen to the symphony with all the rest of the elementary schools. So I was just curious how the community was impacted here.
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about the history of those concerts, which I think we're on year 6 or 7 maybe now of the Young People's Concerts. And it started whenever the last time we did the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique, because I thought, well, that's an easy thing to talk about. The concert fell on Halloween, so we had this sort of built-in thing going on. And so that was just a thought that we would open it up. It was preceded by, I think I did this for 2 years before the Friday dress rehearsals, meeting with elementary school kids and their parents in the East Room of Mandeville. And that wasn't particularly well organized on our part. So the administrative structure is always a thing we have to make sure we talk about, because I think the idea was good, but it wasn't supported by the structure very well. And so then the next version of that was those concerts. And it was kind of like, people come to the free dress rehearsals anyway. There was always a couple of hundred people there. And so we just thought, well, bring your kids. That was the first thing. And it was so amazing. And the thing that drove it, I think, then was because the orchestra loved it. The orchestra really loved that. And they loved the questions that came from the kids. And so this became then the thing. We play something, but the main thing was watching little kids. Like when we did Beethoven 5 for one of them, this little third grader or whatever asked if I could please explain the Japanese concept of ma to him. I said, I don't think I can. But what he was talking about, which was fascinating, was the fact that the piece begins with a silence, and the orchestra had never really taken that on board. So in a way, I hadn't really thought about this, but in a way that the way in which the children ask us questions becomes that space where we can learn from them. So I do think it has made some difference, and now it's been long enough so that the people who were kids in those first ages are now some of them UCSD students, so that we can see kind of cycles repeating. But I guess when we talk about how to plug your activities, to come back more to the point, how to plug your self-starting activities into an institutional structure that can support them, that's that little bridge that is so fragile, because the institution has to really support it if this is a goal from people, and it has to be followed through. It's pretty easy to have like a good experience, and it's really hard to have 10 of them. And so you just have to have some, a structure that is robust enough to get beyond the kind of, oh, now we've done that, what comes next? Somebody to insist on the second, third, and fourth generations of an idea.
I think there's something here, though, and I hope, if not at this meeting, sometime in the future, we follow up on this idea of making use of the talent, all of the talents that are on campus, whether they're in courses or doing things out of their own goodwill. I think that deserves to be followed up on. I mean, I'm going through my brain as a former chair of the department, and I'm ticking off what's wrong with this idea, how's this going to blow up in my face. And I can see 7 or 8 ways it could, but I think we ought to think of 7 or 8 ways to figure this out. USC does something like this. UCLA does something like this. This is not new news, but I think we've sort of allowed academic credit, to be the dividing line between what people do out of the love of their hearts and what institutions do out of a requirement. I mean, that's what I think we need to bridge. And again, I'm speaking with the hat of a chairman on, because the first thing you think of is, how could this go wrong? And
we used to, and I think also doing programming outside of the campus, bring bringing our music outside. I think that's really been a missing link with our, because in a way, when we look at performances in our space, we have too many productions, and we don't have a staff to support it. It's like all those issues come to the fore. And also we know there used to be programs like Arts Bridge. I remember years ago we had, when I was first there, had a program, Arts Bridge, which brought students in close contact with a class. It could be elementary school or middle school, in the San Diego Unified District. Also in Chula Vista, and I found that was really interesting, because a lot of interesting projects came out of it. And I was sorry that they abandoned Arts Bridge. I think maybe now is an opportunity, because when we see that we get back after this post-COVID period, we get back together. There should be hopefully with different administration and federal government, et cetera, but also it's a time for the kind of WPA, CCC thing, so this idea of the government putting resources into having, activity, to restart the economy, et cetera, but also, so I think we along with that, part of that would be to bring musicians into the community to do activities. Should be a big part of something like that.
That's absolutely right, what Anthony said. And then the other thing that just occurs to me, and this could really be the home for such a thing, is that if there's a project that is close to the Chancellor's heart right now, it's the downtown campus, which has arts performance spaces and no content. And so if there's a way of making actual things realized out of this that would take place not in a spot where you have to drive onto campus like at UCSD, you can't find parking, you don't think you belong, but in a place where it's easy to get to. I think this could really be an opening. So that would be maybe practical idea number one. Practical idea number two, which I'll come back to, is the idea that very often with the La Jolla Symphony or with our audiences or even with the department, people who are in the situation of the SSA students that I'm looking at rely on people like me as an intermediary to explain points of view to other people. So I wonder if we could take the intermediary out and have a moment, as I said, with the La Jolla Symphony where a group of us goes directly to the board to say, this seems missing to us. Or could we transform some of the pre-concert talks that I always do before the concerts into conversations that where you all, some of you at least in different kinds of formations, could be a part of those talks, so that we could talk to the audience directly about what you think, as opposed to always needing to be mediated by somebody that represents you in the structures of power that can actually really change things. So I'd like not to drop that aspect of this conversation also, so that we actually perhaps we'll have a little think group about very specific plans that we can take to the board of my orchestra and to the institutions, and frankly, we could do that to the music faculty as well. I think that it would be great to sit around a faculty meeting with and hear directly from people.
I move by trying to set up things that have long-term benefit and are substantial. And, if something like this were to evolve where young people on campus become part of the outreach and inreach within the campus, then we ought to do it in some structure that it has some permanency. I mean, you're all going to graduate in the next 3 to 4 years, and then we have to build it again. But is there some way that this could be built into what the university does? Academic credit is the obvious way, but what I'm thinking is we have Troy School right around the corner and deep ties with Gompers downtown. Can we start with schools that we already have connection? We have liability contracts, so if you fall off a tree and break your neck, you're covered. And again, this is the chairman speaking. Could we think about how we can use the instruments that are already available to the campus, where all of the structural relationships have been worked out? And it seems when you start building without a wheel, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And we have these pieces that already exist. I mean, we students who were tutoring at Preuss and Gompers get academic credit. Depending on their major, could count toward their major or their minor.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea.
Yeah, that really is.
And yeah, I wouldn't discount because I know that the org has been around for IMEM for like 3 years, and so there are schools that they've been at for 3 years.
Yeah.
And so I think those relationships are also important, because getting your foot in the door is actually one of the biggest hurdles. I think that's what you were trying to say with, like, you already have these relationships, and that's true. It absolutely is true. And I think they also have relationships, and there are enough music students and musicians in general that I think it'd be worth it.
I remember we did something a couple of years ago. I am not involved deeply with Preuss nowadays, but some years ago, we were offering AP math classes at Gompers for Gompers students. And it turned out students were coming from every other high school in the neighborhood to take these prep classes. So, I mean, it'll radiate whatever it is. If there's something good happening, we'll seek it out. We can be the instruments of that.
Yeah, that's important.
These are some amazing ideas. So you mentioned a program at the Preuss School, the Chancellor's Downtown Art Space, which I actually didn't even know about. Is there information on that online?
Yeah, it's part of Extension. You can see some, and they plan. There's a performance space there, as well as different kind of studio spaces, and it's kind of Mary Walshock is kind of head of Extension, is behind a lot of the stuff, and I think it'll be potentially really exciting. They're also going to have a United States Mexico Center in it as well. So looking for outreach to Mexico, et cetera. But also, it's interesting because it kind of coincides with the trolley. You know, like now you can take a trolley from here down to by the time it's built, you could take a trolley to the UCSD extension buildings, which will be down. It's like think near Market Street and G Street around there.
Boulevard and Market.
Yeah, and the other thing that just occurs to me also is that, you know, Teddy Cruz and Fana Foreman, who are activists within the university on social justice, are building and have built in San Ysidro a small art space right on the border. And there, I think they have 3 spaces, 2 in the United States and 1 in Tijuana, that are connected. So there are, I don't think that, you know, apropos of what Cecil was saying, the institutional infrastructure for those things doesn't yet exist, I don't think, but the spaces do. And so this is sort of ripe for the building, I would think.
Mm-hmm. And I think the chancellor would be very supportive.
Absolutely.
I mean, he wants
this is it. Yeah.
This is really what he wants to do. So I think that we have a strong voice, some strong person who wants to advance the issues of diversity and inclusion. So I think we should take advantage of it now.
And there's something percolating at Preuss in particular, and that is the idea of building an elementary school south of 8 that would be the feeder school for Preuss. And as you said a while ago, Gabby, you got to start early. So starting youngsters in kindergarten on quarter-sized violins and so on. Yeah, that could play into it very effectively.
That would be great.
Yes, definitely. So it's just about that time, 2 p.m. And I think that's an amazing note to end on. Really incredibly gracious of you people to offer these real world suggestions. And we'll reach out, this is SSA, but we'll reach out to the other music orgs and sort of share this knowledge. And if anyone has any last questions and comments, and if not, then I pass it on to Victoria, who's the host of the meeting. And
I would just say, thank you, Gabi. I would just say that please this is such important stuff that we really don't want to let it drop.
Exactly.
The summer, and as we come back online after the pandemic, this is a built-in period of preparation. Normally we feel like we're just being pressed forward by our schedules. Now we have actually a little bit of a space in which to plan these things. So we'll, let's continue with this energy. I think it's wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting us and for setting this up.
It allows us to think more long term, not just in terms of what we have to do this fall, et cetera, but also, you know, what we think the future should be, you know, after the virus. So in a way that this period, it's a blessing in a sense that we have that time to really think and reconsider what we're doing.
I like the statement someone said, I think Chris Rock or someone said, don't waste the crisis.
Yeah, that's right. Don't waste the crisis. Exactly.
Thank you, everyone. Gabby invited me, so I'll thank you personally.
Thanks, Gabby. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Great to see everybody. Okay. Thanks.
All
Bye.
right. Thank you all for coming.